To help us unpack this, let's now welcome Isaac Khambule, Professor of Political Economy at the University of Johannesburg. Prof, a very good afternoon to you, and thank you so much for your time as we continue then to get reaction following the budget. So we just heard earlier, Cabinet has welcomed the 2025 budget as government needs to cover a 16 billion rands shortfall. What are your thoughts on the budget that was tabled yesterday? In the main, you know, of course, the increase of value-added tax continues to be a point of contestation. Was the increase by half a percentage point a good compromise, do you think?
That at this particular time, it was not necessarily a good compromise, even within the parties that are within the GNU, because what we are seeing here is majority of South Africa's economy is not growing. And secondly, again, we also understand that based on what has been happening, a lot of people remain unemployed. So if we do increase tax, we value-added tax, we understand that it is mainly those who are poor who are going to pay more. And in as much as the tax does not necessarily impact those who are wealthy, the issue now is what happens to the poor. And as we have heard from the Minister of Finance, the mere fact that there was a K22 between dropping the SRD grants and as well as increasing tax, that on its own shows you that we are at a particular stance in South Africa where we are seeing a lot of economic impasse. And as we are, as it is, it shows that the government has really run out of option in terms of finding alternative ways of generating the revenue that it needs to also afford the kind of social grants that we have, and as well as the social security that it has been embarking on for the 30 years in post-apartheid South Africa. So it is quite interesting. And as I've indicated, the issue of the contestation of VAT, it does not necessarily let us know as to whether the entire parliament is going to accept the budget as it is, or whether they will ask for a revised budget. But definitely, there's more discussions that are going to emerge as of this particular budget speech.
Yeah, I know the coming days are a big worry, particularly for South Africans, as we know that this budget proposal essentially is now going to have to go through the parliamentary processes. But just on that issue that you speak of in terms of growth, I mean, in 2024, the economy grew by only 0.6%. We understand that over the next, the medium term, GDP growth is projected to average 1.8%. The minister, in starting his speech yesterday, said that the bigger debate is simply on how to grow the economy. What for you were those key points that speak to economic growth?
There's been major points, and I think the issue now that we have been debating on is the issue of structural reforms. What kinds of structural reforms does South Africa need? And in addition to this, again, some of the key things are also related to what allowance are we going to give the private sector. And as we've had issues of allowing the private sector and the transportation sector, we've also had a number of other parties also talking about the idea of involving the private sector in the running of South Africa's ports, of which have not been doing quite well. So if we look at all of those particular reforms and understand their nature, again, they also tend to produce contradictory development outcomes, because in certain cases the economy might grow, but it may not necessarily address issues of unemployment and as well as poverty. So these contradictory developments have been happening, I think, for some time in South Africa. And the issue of growth on its own, as we've mentioned, 0.6 is not doing the country quite well. We know that based on the NDP, we are expected to grow at a rate of 3 to 5%, something that we have dismally failed to do over the last 10 to 12 years since we adopted the NDP. And this is definitely an indictment on the current government. And it shows that, again, we need more mechanisms to grow the economy. And some of these mechanisms, again, how do we then promote sustainable development in South Africa through business development? And how do we then also grow businesses that are going to employ the majority of South Africans that live in poverty and unemployment? And the last one is, how do we also reindustrialize? Because we know the country has been so heavily deindustrialized over the last 30 years, which is why we have lost so many jobs within the industrial sector. So now, how do we go back to the drawing table and say, how do we reindustrialize? In as much as we come up with many of these strategies, we know majority of the jobs that we need to create are within the industrial sector. And these are some of the pivotal things that the government needs to be focusing on in order to address the issue of unemployment, poverty, and inequality. And the last one, again, is how do we also make sure that our local government are going to deliver the services that they are supposed to, and how do we also build competitive developmental local government that is going to spur growth and development. And as it is, we have received lesser focus on making local governments capable, because without capable governments, we see the collapse in municipalities, we see the collapse in infrastructure, and all of those again are going to undermine the growth of our economy.
And he did touch on local government quite a bit in his budget, particularly, it draws the attention back to just some of the reports that we've been seeing from the Auditor General, as an example, in terms of her concerns around how the spend is dealt with at local government level. But just going back to some of your comments, I want to touch a little bit about social spending. I mean, some may point out that it still accounts for a sizable chunk of the budget. Just looking at future projections, what other avenues do you think are available to government to curb this spending?
And I think that's the toughest question that the government is even failing to respond to at this current moment. And for me, the idea is, again, in order for us to be able to lower the pool of those who are in social grants, it means we need to create sustainable jobs and jobs that are going to pay above the minimum wage. And at this current case, South Africa is unable to do that, because we know there's a particular relationship between unemployment and lesser people who are within social grants. And the moment South Africa gets to address that particular issue is definitely the moment that we are going to see a lot of growth, because we've seen, again, statistics that are showing us that 1 in every 2 households in South Africa has someone who's earning a social grant, and that is not sustainable as it is. In as much as there's a bit of a welfare state in the country, we understand that there are particular important means that are going to be sustainable in order to address this, such as job creation and as well as the growth of our economy. And again, as I've indicated, some of the strategies that can be leveraged by the government are a strong focus on ensuring that we produce sustainable businesses that are going to be productive for a productive economy. And secondly, one of the key things is how do we also enable South Africa's development finance institutions to also play a catalytic role in addressing the issue of a lack of funding for majority of our businesses, and as well as, lastly, the most important point, also ensuring that we have enough business investor confidence in the country in order to be able to attract the foreign direct investment that we need, and as well as also continue creating the types of jobs that we need in order to address the huge issue of people on social grants, and as well as also ensuring that we move people away from being languishing in poverty.
All right, Prof, thank you so much for your time. Let's leave it there for now. Professor Isaac Khambule is a professor of political economy at the University of Johannesburg.